Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. The Battle of Harby Hill. In the 113th year of the Common Reckoning, Asta, the queen of the dwarves of the Dark Hills, led an army of 700 dwarves toward Unnascrag. Her intention was to make war on Ingvild, the lady of Unnascrag, and her son Halvard, who laid claim to Asta's crown. Ingvild and Halvard were not entirely unprepared for war. They were at this time themselves gathering an army to march against the Hillhold. Thus, although their troops were not fully mustered, Ingvild and Halvard did have some 400 fighting dwarves at their immediate disposal. Halvard took this force and led it out to do battle, supplemented by 100 or so hastily raised levies. The place he chose to intercept Asta was Harby Hill. Harby Hill took the form of a ridge running east to west. The highest point of the ridge was at its eastern end, which was crowned with trees. From this summit a long bare ridge descended westwards, and along this ridge were spread the buildings and walled fields of the farm known as Harby, from which the hill took its name. Halvard's army included some 250 unarmoured crossbow dwarves. He positioned these on the northern side of the farm, sheltered behind the field walls, split into two groups. Some distance behind them he placed his levy troops. These dwarves were also unarmoured, but they did carry shields. They were armed with axes. That left Halvard's guard, 150 spear dwarves, clad in mail and bearing shields. They surrounded Halvard, who placed himself at the eastern end of the farm, on the southern slopes of the hill, in a position where the rising crest of the ridge concealed him from Asta and her advancing force. Asta's warriors were all armoured. Half of them carried crossbows, and half bore shield and spear. The army marched toward Harby Hill with the crossbow dwarves in the van, while Asta and the spear dwarves followed behind. Beneath the farm, at the foot of the northern slopes of Harby Hill, was a small wood. Asta sent half of her crossbow dwarves into the trees. The other crossbow dwarves veered to their left, advancing so as to pass the wood on that side, while the spear dwarves moved the other way, so as to pass the wood on its right. These manoeuvres brought Asta's army within range of the crossbow dwarves lining the field walls atop Harby Hill. Crossbow bolts started to whistle through the air, and gaps opened in the ranks of the advancing dwarves. The group of Asta's crossbow dwarves advancing in the open halted, intending to return the compliment. But before they could bring their crossbows to bear, a second volley of well-directed bolts inflicted yet more casualties on them, throwing them into disorder and confusion. In the centre, Asta's other group of crossbow dwarves advanced to the edge of the wood. From the protection of the trees, they started to snipe at the crossbow dwarves lining the field walls above them, but to little effect. Asta observed that she was being bested in the battle of the crossbow dwarves. She therefore urged her spear dwarves forward, seeking to attack her foes hand to hand. Some of Halvard's crossbow dwarves now turned their attention to the advancing spear dwarves, but they had less success against this new target. The spear dwarves put their shields to good use and pushed on without suffering significant casualties. This attack on the advancing spear dwarves also reduced the numbers of bolts flying in the direction of Asta's crossbow dwarves, who were thus able to recover and regroup. Asta's spear dwarves advanced up the hillside, straight toward the crossbow dwarves Halvard had placed on his left flank. As the spear dwarves closed with them, The crossbow dwarves loosed yet another flight of bolts at their advancing foes, and then retreated in good order. As Aster's spear dwarves swarmed over the wall, the retreating crossbow dwarves paused long enough to shoot one last volley of bolts, before falling back on the levied troops arrayed behind them. The levy's ranks opened to allow the crossbow dwarves to pass through them, and then closed again, forming a shield wall, preparing for the onslaught of the spear dwarves. Halvard's levies were brave. They stood their ground in the face of the host bearing down on them, but their bravery could not compensate for the greater numbers, better equipment, regular training, and fighting experience of Aster's spear dwarves. The spear dwarves crashed into the shield wall disintegrated, and the majority of the levies were slain before they even had a chance to strike back. On Halvard's right, his other group of crossbow dwarves was still having the best of the long-range duel with Aster's remaining crossbow dwarves, who had now coalesced into a single group. But Halvard's concern was his disintegrating left wing. He ordered his spear dwarves forward up to the main ridge, and ordered the crossbow dwarves on his right flank to turn to their left and redirect their crossbow bolts towards Aster's spear dwarves. But once more shields and mail proved resistant to the bolts of Halvard's crossbow dwarves. Unperturbed by the hail of missiles being launched at them, Aster's spear dwarves casually dispatched the last of the levy axe dwarves before turning to their left and advancing against these new adversaries. Now that they were no longer being targeted by Halvard's crossbow dwarves, Aster's crossbow dwarves resumed their advance toward the hill in front of them, and even as they did so, the crossbow dwarves who had tormented them for so long were being cut down by Aster's spear dwarves. The advance of Aster's crossbow dwarves brought them within range of Halvard and his spear dwarves, and at this point Halvard lost his nerve. Faced with the prospect of being peppered by crossbow bolts and then charged by a rampaging horde of spear dwarves who outnumbered his guard 2-1, Halvard decided that discretion was the better part of valour. In other words, he ran away. Seeing their leader and his guard withdrawing from the field, the remnants of Halvard's army did likewise. Aster won the victory, and Halvard won nothing but eternal shame, as the dwarf who fled before even crossing swords with his foes. Thus ended the Battle of Harby Hill.